Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. We've got a really impactful deep dive ahead of us today. We're going to be looking at Frank Dikotter's Mao's Great Famine. It's not just a history, it's a meticulously researched investigation into what happened during China's Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1962.
And it's a period that stands as one of the most, well, I'd say significant human tragedies of the entire 20th century. And Dikotter's work, really drawing on this incredible amount of archival material, offers a, I think, unflinching look at it, essential for us to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to say right up front, this is sensitive, right? This is a sensitive topic. And so we're going to try to approach it, as respectfully as possible, guided by the evidence that Dikotter presents. So to give our listeners a bit of a roadmap, what are the main themes we're going to be exploring today?
Well, I think at the heart of the book is this. The Great Leap Forward, which was, this incredibly ambitious push to industrialize China rapidly and achieve this vision of a communist utopia. Well, it tragically spiraled into, one of the largest famines in all of recorded history.
Wow.
And we're going to look at the specific policies, we're going to look at the motivations of Mao Zedong and really the party leadership as a whole, and then, of course, the social and environmental repercussions. And one of the things that we're going to really examine closely is the gap, this huge gap between the utopian vision that was being promoted by the leadership and the horrific reality that was experienced on the ground by ordinary people.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so compelling, right? It's this idea versus the reality. What are some other areas we're going to be focusing on?
Well, we'll look at the command economy, that system where the state controlled all the production and distribution. And we'll see how that played a critical role in the disaster. And we'll examine the human cost of all these relentless political campaigns.
Right.
We'll look at survival strategies, and we'll also look at the lasting impact of this period, how it impacted Chinese society and the environment.
And it strikes me that one thing that sets this book apart, this work apart, is the sheer depth and range of the sources that Dikotter used.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's groundbreaking because it draws on all this archival material that was previously, this was secret. This is stuff from the Public Security Bureau. Their internal reports, detailed minutes from these top-level party meetings, unexpurgated speeches from key leaders. So we're seeing a much rawer view than we've seen before. Even surveys that show the reality of the conditions in the countryside. And all of this spans multiple levels of government. You've got provinces like Hebei, Shandong, Gansu, Hubei, Hunan, Zhejiang, Sichuan, Guizhou, Yunnan, Guangdong, and even Beijing itself.
Wow.
He even included material from cities, counties. The depth of research is staggering.
So we're really looking at the top levels of decision-making, but also individual experiences.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how are we going to approach all of this?
Chronologically, we're going to follow the story as Dikotter lays it out. Starting at the beginning, how did all this utopian fervor, these policies, how did they end up leading to such devastating outcomes?
All right, so let's start at the beginning. Let's look at the Great Leap Forward and how it began. And Dikotter, he kicks off the book by talking about what was happening in the communist world after Stalin died, 1953. And Mao's ambitions. He's starting to think about things on a global scale.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, to see how the relationship between Mao and the Soviet Union changed. Because, after Stalin died, there was this sense of opportunity for Mao, who had always been kind of in Stalin's shadow, Khrushchev even. He really tried to build this positive relationship with Beijing.
But that didn't last long.
Not at all. 1956, everything changes.
Yeah. Khrushchev denounces Stalin.
And it's such a pivotal moment. You see, Mao initially saw this as a good thing, weakening Moscow, but he also deeply resented it because it called into question Stalin's agricultural policies. And for Mao, who was so committed to collectivization, this was a direct attack on his own approach.
So it sounds like this suspicion of the Soviet model really pushed Mao to create this distinctly Chinese path to communism.
Exactly. He wanted to be the leader, not just in China, but in the communist world. He wanted a unique path and a more radical one. And this ambition really helps us understand why the Great Leap Forward ended up being so extreme.
Right. And then following that, you have the 100 Flowers campaign and how quickly it was reversed in 1957. How did that impact the climate going into the Great Leap Forward?
The 100 Flowers campaign, it was this brief moment where intellectuals were actually encouraged to share their opinions. But then, boom, the anti-rightist campaign hits. And this crackdown really solidified Mao's fear of anyone he saw as a rightist conservative. And this resistance, he believed, was the main thing holding back his revolution. So the failure of the 100 Flowers, it really served to silence any dissent, and it gave Mao even more power.
So now you have this backdrop of, well, complicated international relations, internal criticism being suppressed, and it's in this context that the Great Leap Forward is launched. How did it all officially begin?
Well, Dikötter points out that after Mao gets back from the Soviet Union, he gets this crucial support from Liu Shaoqi. This is the guy who is seen as Mao's potential successor. And he really embraces this idea of a leap forward. And around this time, you start hearing this really optimistic slogan everywhere, go all out and aim high. It became the party line, meant to mobilize the entire nation.
And it wasn't just Liu Shaoqi, right? There were other key figures who played a role.
Oh, absolutely. People like Li Fushun, who headed the State Planning Commission. He created these incredibly detailed economic blueprints, setting production targets for every single province. And then you have Zhou Enlai. Now, Zhou Enlai, he might have been more aware of the potential problems, but he still played a key role in putting Mao's often unrealistic ideas into practice.
It's interesting how Dikötter describes Zhou Enlai. He calls him the midwife, the one who helped bring Mao's nightmares into reality. What does that tell us about their dynamic?
It shows you just how complicated and precarious Zhou Enlai's position was. He was incredibly competent, absolutely loyal to Mao, and his skills, they were essential for turning Mao's sometimes vague pronouncements into actual policies. He was always being watched.
Yeah.
He always had to prove his loyalty, so in a way he was almost trapped, facilitating some of Mao's most extreme initiatives.
So while Zhou Enlai is navigating this difficult situation, what was happening to people who actually opposed the Great Leap Forward, or even just expressed some doubts?
Dikötter, he documents this widespread campaign of suppression and purging of party members across the country. People who opposed Mao's radical policies. And this happened in provinces all over China. Gansu, Yunnan, Henan, Guangdong, even in places like Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Qinghai, Anhui, Liaoning, Hebei.
Wow.
For example, in Gansu, if you even questioned the grain procurement policies, you were labeled a rightist.
Oh, wow.
Zhang Zongling orchestrated this brutal purge. Hundreds of thousands denounced, thousands kicked out of the party, and similar purges happened all over, often led by these ambitious local leaders who wanted to get rid of rivals and prove they were loyal to Mao. And this silencing of critical voices, this is really key to understanding how the Great Leap Forward could continue even when it was clear it was failing.
It created this atmosphere where people were afraid to speak up.
Absolutely. Speaking out had serious consequences. And this meant that the truth about what was happening wasn't reaching the leadership, and it incentivized local officials to not only go along with these radical policies, but to exaggerate them.
So this fear then leads to the early stages of mass mobilization, right? Dikötter talks about these water conservancy projects. What were they all about?
Right, these were these huge projects, central to the early vision of the Great Leap Forward. The idea was to improve irrigation dramatically, boost agricultural output, all through sheer human labor.
Wow.
And what's chilling is that Mao himself seemed to understand that there would be a human cost. There's this quote where he says that for every billion cubic meters of earth moved, there will be a certain number of deaths. It's awful.
Yeah.
But despite this, the projects continued. Forced labor, impossible targets. People were exhausted, injured, dying. It really highlights this disturbing willingness to sacrifice individual lives for some greater good that wasn't even real.
And then alongside these immense physical demands, you also have these inflated reports of how successful these projects were.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure on local officials to show they were succeeding, to be in line with this go all out and aim high slogan,
Yeah.
it was immense. So they exaggerated, especially when it came to crop yields. Henan province became like this showcase for inflated claims. Officials like Tan Zenlin, they actually encouraged, even demanded, that people fabricate these ridiculously high harvest figures. They created this completely false image of how much food was actually being produced.
Wow.
And this is a really important point. When information is distorted by fear, by this pressure to conform, even policies that might have good intentions, they can be twisted and lead to disastrous consequences.
Which leads us to these almost mythical Sputniks of record-breaking harvests. I mean, we're talking yields that would be impossible, right?
Absolutely. These unbelievable reports started coming in from communes like Chaishan and Macheng. They claim these astronomical yields, and they back them up with these bizarre practices, like moving houses just to use the soil as fertilizer, or planting seedlings way too close together. And the state-controlled media, they ate it up. They presented these as miracles. And this just reinforced the leadership's belief that their policies were working, even though it was all a lie.
So you have this internal fervor building, but at the same time, Mao's relationship with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union is continuing to fall apart.
Yeah, Mao's suspicion of Khrushchev, it just kept growing. And this tension, it really came to a head when Khrushchev visited Beijing in July of 1959. The reception he got was cold. A far cry from the hospitality Mao had received in Moscow just a few months earlier. It was a very public display of the growing divide between these two communist powers.
And all of this is happening while the people's communes are being established at this incredible pace. What was the initial vision for these communes?
Well, the idea was that these communes would be these massive self-sufficient units that would, in theory, speed up the transition to a fully communist society. The ideals, they were utopian, this complete militarization of labor, communal living, shared canteens, dormitories, nurseries, and all private property was confiscated. There were even these rumors going around about extreme communalization, like shared blankets and numbered clothing. It was a radical reshaping of rural life.
And another big part of the Great Leap Forward was this push for rapid industrialization. And the symbol of that, of course, is the backyard steel furnace campaign. What was that all about?
Well, the aim was to increase China's steel production massively and rapidly. And they did this by mobilizing everyone to build these small, often very basic furnaces in their backyards. They used local materials, indigenous techniques. And Mao, he really pushed this idea that the wisdom of the peasants was superior to the knowledge of so-called bourgeois specialists. And of course, they set these really unrealistic production targets, which just fuel this nationwide frenzy to produce steel, no matter the quality.
But the reality of these backyard furnaces was far from the vision, right?
Tragically so. The conditions were awful. People were working with inadequate food, exhausted, no safety precautions. There were accidents, injuries. And the steel they produced, it was often terrible quality, brittle, unusable. And despite the pressure, there were even some protests. People questioning the whole thing. It was a huge waste of resources, labor, fuel, materials, and for very little gain.
So as these inflated crop yield figures kept being reported, what impact did that have on the actual amount of food in the countryside?
It was a disaster. The central government, they believed there were these huge grain surpluses, all because of these fake reports.
Right.
So they increased the amount of grain they were taking from the countryside. And people like Tanzenlin, they were really aggressive about pushing for higher quotas. They believed the reports, they were committed to meeting the targets. And this taking of grain based on lies, it directly led to the famine.
Even with all the talk of these incredible harvests, were there any signs early on that things were going wrong?
There were. Some areas started experiencing severe food shortages, even starvation. Sushui was one example. And Mao, he got reports about these problems, but he dismissed them. He saw the Great Leap Forward as this military campaign where sacrifices were inevitable. Even Chen Yi, the foreign minister, talked about casualties as if it was just part of the plan. It's really disturbing to see this disconnect between what the leaders believed and the reality on the ground.
So it was a military campaign where the enemy was, well, reality. Let's move on to part 2, which Dikötter calls shopping spree. It's an odd title, considering the food crisis that was developing. What was happening on the economic front?
Well, this shopping spree refers to all the industrial equipment and technology that China was buying from the Soviet Union after Mao got back from Moscow. The leadership was obsessed with industrializing quickly. That was the whole point of the Great Leap Forward.
So even as agriculture was being squeezed and food production was falling, they were spending huge amounts of money on industrial tech from abroad.
Exactly. And this made China more and more dependent on the Soviet Union. Their debt was growing. And to pay for it all, they started pushing exports, even food exports. This is while people were already going hungry.
Wow.
Zhu Enlai even suggested that people should eat less pork so they could export more meat. It shows how distorted their priorities were.
That's incredible, putting exports ahead of feeding their own people. Did anyone consider the impact on the quality of these exports, with all this pressure to produce more?
Well, as the pressure increased, quality suffered. Local units started cutting corners just to meet their quotas. And this actually started damaging China's trade relationships. People saw that the quality was going down, and they didn't trust China as a reliable partner.
So this focus on quantity over quality actually backfired.
It did. It hurt them in the long run.
With all the misinformation going around and the clear signs of trouble, were there any mechanisms within the party to see these problems and tell the leadership?
Well, they had this internal monitoring system. The idea was to get information directly to the top, bypassing the usual bureaucracy. But in reality, it didn't work that well. Everyone was afraid, they were pressured to conform, so the reports weren't accurate.
Right.
Mao knew that he might be getting false reports, so he tried other things, like small group discussions with selected leaders. He did this at the Lushan Conference. But even then, people were hesitant to speak their minds. They were afraid of the consequences.
And the Lushan Conference is where Peng Dehuai criticized the Great Leap Forward, right? And that had serious consequences.
It did. It was a turning point. Peng Dehuai, he was a respected figure, a military leader, and he was brave enough to tell Mao and the others that the Great Leap Forward was causing serious problems. But instead of listening, Mao got angry. He denounced Peng and anyone who agreed with him as an anti-party clique. And this led to more purges, more silencing of dissent. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
While Peng Dehuai is being punished for telling the truth, Zhongliang in Gansu is sending these positive reports, hiding the famine that was already happening in his province.
So instead of fixing the problems, they just got rid of the people who were pointing them out. How did this impact the ordinary people?
It made them even more vulnerable. The purges got rid of the moderate, more pragmatic leaders. And it empowered the radicals. These guys were driven by ideology, by fear of being labeled a rightist. They were even more ruthless in implementing the Great Leap Forward's policies, and they refused to acknowledge the disaster that was unfolding.
And while all this is going on, the relationship with the Soviet Union keeps getting worse, leading to the Sino-Soviet split. What caused that?
It was a mix of things. Ideological differences, for one. Mao thought Khrushchev was a revisionist. Then there was the border dispute between China and India. Moscow didn't support Beijing as strongly as Mao wanted, and Mao became more and more critical of Khrushchev and the Soviet way of doing things. The final straw was when Khrushchev pulled all the Soviet advisors out of China in 1960. They took their expertise with them, and this really hurt China's economy.
So now the Soviet Union isn't there to help. How did China try to deal with the famine and the economic crisis?
Well, they started importing grain from non-communist countries like Australia, Canada, and Argentina. It was a practical move, but also risky politically. But they still needed to export goods to pay for these imports and their debts. So you had this crazy situation where they were importing food while also exporting it.
That doesn't make any sense.
It didn't, but they were desperate. And by 1961, it was so bad that Zhou Enlai had to admit to their trading partners that China couldn't meet its obligations. They couldn't fulfill contracts. Even grain shipments to the Soviet Union were delayed. It was a humiliating moment.
So the facade was starting to crumble. How did the government initially respond to the reports of famine?
They denied everything. When the Red Cross started asking questions, Beijing said it was all lies and propaganda. They even tried to say that Tibet wasn't part of China when they talked to the Red Cross, just to downplay the problem. It shows how much they cared about their image and control, even more than the lives of their people.
But eventually, the truth had to come out, right? It was too big to ignore.
It was. In October of 1960, a report came in about mass starvation in Xinjiang Prefecture in Henan. This was a region that was supposed to be a model of success, led by Wu Zipu, but the report described tens of thousands of deaths. It was impossible to ignore. Li Shanian, he was a top party official. He was reportedly deeply shaken when he read it. This was a turning point, even though it was too late for many.
So how did Mao react to this news? Did he finally admit that his policies were failing?
No. Instead of blaming the Great Leap Forward, he blamed bad people and feudal forces. He refused to see the flaws in his own ideas. He even went as far as saying, when there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die so that the other half can eat their fill. It's chilling to read those words.
And this system of inflated reporting, it continued to make the famine worse, even when they knew it was happening.
It did. Every level of the bureaucracy was exaggerating the numbers. Local officials wanted to please their superiors to show they were loyal, so the figures kept going up and up. By the time they reached the top, they were completely meaningless. But Li Fuchen, he used those figures to set national targets. And that meant even more grain was taken from the countryside, from people who were already starving.
It must have been almost impossible to get accurate information during those years.
It was. The official statistics are completely unreliable. The party wanted to hide the scale of the disaster. Even later attempts to get accurate numbers, like those from the Bureau for Grain, are probably underestimates. But there's a glimmer of truth in the records from local statistical bureaus. Between 1962 and 1965, some of them tried to reconstruct what really happened. And their numbers are much higher than the official ones. It shows you how much the party manipulated the truth.
Dikötter even includes some really cynical quotes from high-ranking
He
officials.
does. Deng Xiaoping, for example, in 1961, when it was clear how bad the famine was, he defended the high grain procurements in Sichuan, even though millions had already died there. And then you have that chilling quote from Mao about letting half the population die so the other half could eat. It's hard to believe.
What about the farmers themselves? Did they have any incentive to produce more food?
No, not really. The prices the government paid for grain were so low that farming wasn't profitable. And they couldn't even choose what to grow. They had to follow the orders of the local cadres who were following the party line. There's no economic freedom, no incentive to work harder. They were basically forced laborers.
So they were being squeezed from all sides. And then there's this shift in the types of crops being grown.
Yeah, there was this focus on maximizing yields, even if the crops weren't that nutritious or useful. So they planted less rice and wheat and more sweet potatoes. But the government didn't really want sweet potatoes. So the farmers were stuck with these less nutritious crops, and that just made the problem worse.
As the food ran out, people must have been desperate.
There were. By 1960, in some places, they were eating cotton seeds. But those are poisonous. So many people died. They were eating anything they could find. Leather belts, straw, even the cotton padding from their clothes. Hu Yaobang, he traveled around in 1961, and he saw how bad it was. He saw what people were reduced to. It's heartbreaking.
And it wasn't just people who were starving. The livestock were decimated.
Absolutely. It was worse than during the war with Japan. Pigs were so hungry they started eating each other. The whole system of animal husbandry collapsed. It was a huge loss, not just for food, but for agriculture in general.
And what about industry? Wasn't the Great Leap Forward supposed to help industry?
It was, but it actually hurt it. Factories were neglected, resources were diverted. Big plants like the one in Wuhan, they were operating way below capacity. There weren't enough raw materials, not enough energy, not enough skilled workers. And the tools, the machinery, they were poorly maintained, sometimes even deliberately damaged so they could get scrap metal for the backyard furnaces. It was a culture of waste. Quality didn't matter, only quantity.
And the conditions for the workers?
Terrible. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, not enough food. There was malnutrition, disease. And then the famine and the countryside started to affect the cities. Workers who had come from villages started going back home to find food. It was chaos.
So this obsession with numbers, it backfired on them.
Completely. It was inefficient, wasteful. The steel from the backyard furnaces cost more to make than it was worth. Factories were shut down because there wasn't enough coal or electricity. The transportation system couldn't keep up. Goods are piling up, rotting. It was a complete mess.
Even traditional crafts and markets were affected.
They were. The planned economy, it destroyed the diversity of goods. Local markets, which were so important for people's livelihoods, were shut down. The state wanted to control everything. And that just made people poorer and less able to cope with the famine.
But even with all this control, some aspects of the old system remained, didn't they?
Ironically, yes. The black market thrived. People were bartering, trading ration coupons, anything to get what they needed. There was even inflation. And luxury goods, they were being sold at crazy prices. It shows that even in a planned economy, supply and demand still matters, and people will always find a way to make a profit.
It's a stark contrast, all this talk of profit while people are starving.
It is. And it gets worse when you see how the party officials were living. They had access to food and resources that ordinary people could only dream of. Lavish banquets, special product testing sessions, while millions were going hungry. And they built these fancy accommodations for Soviet experts, wasting resources that could have been used to help people. It was a slap in the face to those who were suffering.
And the environment was also devastated.
It was. They demolished homes, public buildings, even historical sites like the Great Wall, all to get materials for their projects. And their land reclamation projects, they were poorly planned. Deforestation, soil erosion, irrigation schemes failed, turning farmland into salt flats. And the factories, they were polluting the air and water.
And then there's the Four Pests campaign.
Oh, that was a disaster. They wanted to get rid of sparrows because they thought they were eating too much grain. But sparrows also eat insects. And without the sparrows, the insect population exploded, and they ate even more crops. It's a perfect example of how they didn't understand the environment and how their actions had unintended consequences.
So in part 3, survival, how did people try to stay alive during all of this?
It was a fight for survival. Some people resisted in small ways, like slaughtering their livestock or hiding grain. Some local cadres used their connections to make sure their own units had enough food. But for most people, it was a daily struggle.
And with the government controlling everything, it must have been hard to find ways to cope.
It was. Even the simplest things required permission from officials. They controlled food rations, travel permits, everything. And that made people even more dependent on the system.
The black market must have been a lifeline for many.
It was. People were bartering, trading ration coupons. There were these makeshift markets everywhere. They risked a lot because the penalties were severe, but they had no other choice.
And with so little food, theft must have been common.
It was rampant. People stole food, supplies, anything they could get their hands on. There were even cases of large-scale corruption by officials. Everyone was trying to survive. Some people even sold their blood. It was a desperate time.
And what about work? Did people still go to work when they were starving?
Many didn't. They were too weak, too demoralized. They would skip work to try and find food or just to conserve their energy. Factory production plummeted.
And the local cadres, how did they try to hide the truth from their superiors?
They lied. They underreported deaths, hid grain, manipulated figures. They were afraid of being punished, so they tried to create this image of success, even though everything was falling apart.
So the social fabric was really starting to tear.
It was. People were turning on each other. Families were breaking down. Children and the elderly were suffering the most. But even then, there were some who resisted. Workers protested, villagers spoke out. They were risking a lot, but they couldn't stay silent.
Were there any other forms of resistance?
Rumors spread quickly. People shared information that contradicted the official line. They wrote letters to the authorities trying to tell them what was really happening. Some even raided trains and granaries, desperate for food. And in some minority regions, like Tibet and Qinghai, there were armed uprisings.
But why wasn't there a larger, more organized resistance movement?
There were a few reasons. Some people still had hope that things would get better. But the biggest reason was the party's control. They had a vast system of surveillance, and they were quick to punish dissent. The purges after the Lucian Conference eliminated any potential leaders for a rebellion.
And then there's the issue of migration. As the famine worsened, people started moving, trying to find food.
They did. Millions tried to escape the famine by going to the cities. But the cities were struggling too. The government tried to stop them. They set up dissuasion stations. But people were desperate. They were willing to risk everything for a chance to survive. Some even tried to flee to Hong Kong.
Part 4 of the book focuses on the most vulnerable groups: children, women, and the elderly.
It's a heartbreaking section. The children suffered terribly. The child care centers, they were supposed to be this great thing, but they became death traps. Disease, neglect, starvation. Parents were abandoning their children, hoping they would have a better chance of survival elsewhere, and the birth rate plummeted because people were too malnourished to even have children.
And women had their own set of challenges.
They did. They were forced to work in the communes, doing heavy labor, and the work point system it discriminated against them, so they got even less food. Childcare disappeared, so they had to do everything. And on top of that, they were vulnerable to abuse and exploitation.
And the elderly.
They were neglected,
Yeah.
forced to work even when they were too weak. They were abused, deprived of basic care. The traditional family structures broke down, so they had no one to rely on. It was a terrible time to be old.
Part 5 is titled Simply Death. It must be the most difficult part of the book to read.
It is. It describes all the ways people died during the famine. Starvation, of course, but also accidents, disease, poisonings. Industrial accidents went up because safety was ignored. Diseases spread because there was no health care. People ate anything they could find, and sometimes it killed them. The government even promoted these substitute foods that were useless or even harmful. And then there was the violence, the torture. Food was used as a weapon. People were deliberately starved to death. Suicide became common. It was hell on earth.
The labor camps must have been especially bad.
They were. Conditions were already brutal, but during the famine, they became death camps. People were worked to death, starved to death, died of disease. And the violence, the torture, it was rampant. It was a system designed to crush the human spirit.
And this wasn't just happening in the camps, right?
No, it was happening everywhere.
Right.
Local militias, party cadres, they were terrorizing the population. There was this idea that you had to be cruel to be loyal. And the weak, the unproductive, they were seen as expendable. It was a terrifying time to be alive.
The use of starvation as a punishment is especially disturbing.
It is. They would give people different amounts of food based on how well they worked or how politically reliable they were. It was a way to control people, to force them to obey. And if you didn't obey, you starved to death.
Dikötter's research also confirms that cannibalism did occur during the famine.
It did, But it wasn't widespread. It was a last resort, a sign of the utter desperation people felt. It's a difficult topic to talk about, but it's important to acknowledge that it happened.
So what's the final estimate of the death toll?
Dikötter says at least 45 million people died. That's a staggering number. It shows the true scale of the disaster. And it's a reminder that we have to be careful about the information we get from authoritarian regimes. The official numbers were much lower, but they were lies. And even some of the materials published later have been censored.
It's been a difficult conversation, but an important one. Mao's Great Famine is a powerful book and a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power.
It is. It shows what can happen when ideology is put before human life, when truth is suppressed, and when dissent is silenced. It's a warning from history that we should never forget.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage everyone to read Mao's Great Famine for themselves and learn from this tragic chapter in history.
It's a book that everyone should read.